In the years after the pandemic, the country was beginning to move forward. The urgency of COVID-19 had slowly faded from daily headlines. The national conversation shifted toward recovery, governance, and the next phase of public policy. The 2022 national election had come and gone. A new administration had taken office. Attention moved away from emergency response and back toward long-term institutions. Among the projects already underway was a major institutional development: a new building for the Senate of the Philippines. For decades, the Senate had operated from a complex in Pasay City, but plans had been approved years earlier to construct a permanent, purpose-built facility in Taguig. The goal was simple: a modern legislative complex designed to house the upper chamber of Congress. Construction had already begun before the pandemic. Like many large infrastructure projects, it continued through shifting economic conditions, supply disruptions, and changing budgets. At first, the project attracted little national attention. Government buildings are rarely headline news. They are planned, funded, and constructed over years, often outside the daily spotlight. But as construction progressed, something began to change. New budget figures appeared in reports. Revised estimates surfaced in committee discussions. Numbers that were once technical details started to grow larger. And with those numbers came questions. At first, they were quiet questions about budgets, about revisions, about how much the new Senate building would ultimately cost. Questions that would soon move from committee rooms into the national conversation. Large public projects rarely remain static. As construction progresses, budgets are often revised. Materials change. Design specifications evolve. Timelines shift. The new Senate building was no exception. Over time, updated cost estimates began appearing in reports and committee discussions.
Note: any figures visually shown in this illustration are representations for explanatory purposes and may not reflect exact official amounts.
Originally approved with a specific construction budget, the project later required additional allocations as work continued. Some revisions were attributed to engineering adjustments, others to expanded design requirements. These revisions are not uncommon in large infrastructure projects. But as the numbers increased, public attention followed. Legislators began raising questions during committee briefings. What exactly had changed in the project specifications? How were the updated figures calculated? And how much more funding might be required before completion? The discussion moved from construction planning to fiscal oversight. As reports circulated, media coverage began to follow the numbers. What had once been a quiet infrastructure project became a topic of national discussion. Not because the building itself had changed, but because the cost of completing it appeared to be rising. Particular attention focused on the finishing stages of the project. Interior design, furnishing, and structural detailing were cited as components of the updated cost estimates. For many observers, these elements became the most visible symbol of the budget revisions. And with that visibility came sharper public scrutiny. As discussions within government continued, the story began to move beyond committee rooms. Reports about the project's rising cost started appearing in national news. Headlines focused on the growing budget figures and the questions raised by lawmakers reviewing the project. What had once been a technical construction matter was now part of the broader national conversation. Legislative reviews intensified. Officials responsible for the project were asked to explain the revised figures and construction adjustments. Questions centered on procurement procedures, engineering decisions, and the long-term cost of completing the building. These discussions reflected a standard function of legislative oversight, but they also drew increased public attention. For many Filipinos, the issue resonated for a familiar reason. Public construction projects are funded by national budgets, and national budgets ultimately come from public resources. Whenever the cost of a government project changes significantly, People begin to ask the same questions. How much will it cost? Why did the numbers change? And how will it affect the national budget? The building itself had not yet been completed. Construction continued. Engineering teams continued their work. But the project had now entered a different phase. Not just construction, but scrutiny. In a country that had recently emerged from years of pandemic crisis, the return of public attention to government spending carried its own significance. The national conversation had shifted again, from emergency response back to questions of public funds and institutional accountability. As the discussion surrounding the project intensified, attention shifted from the rising cost figures to the next question: what should be done about them? Large public projects are rarely halted once construction has begun. But in this case, the growing debate prompted a closer review of the project's status and financial trajectory. Lawmakers requested updated reports on the construction process. Engineering assessments were revisited. Budget allocations were examined once more. The goal, according to officials involved in the review, was to determine how the project could proceed, while ensuring accountability for public funds. Reviews like these are common. When large infrastructure projects encounter cost revisions, they allow institutions to reassess design specifications, procurement arrangements, and projected timelines. But in this case, the review also carried symbolic weight. The Senate itself was examining the construction of its future home. For the public, the situation represented something familiar: a government project, a growing budget, and a renewed debate about transparency. These themes had appeared before in earlier national issues. They were appearing again. The discussion continued across news reports and public forums. Some saw the review as a responsible step toward oversight. Others saw it as evidence that the project required deeper examination. But regardless of perspective, one thing had changed. The new Senate building was no longer just a construction project. It had become a national issue. As reviews of the project continued, the discussion expanded beyond technical assessments. It entered the political arena. Lawmakers began expressing different views about the project's cost, its timing, and its long-term necessity. Some emphasized that the Senate needed a permanent and modern facility capable of supporting legislative work for decades to come. Others questioned whether the scale of the project matched the country's broader priorities. Public projects often trigger this kind of debate, not simply about the project itself, but about opportunity. When national funds are allocated to one major initiative, people naturally ask what other programs might have received those resources instead. Infrastructure, healthcare, education, disaster preparedness. Each represents a different vision of public investment. News coverage and public discussion reflected this tension. Some voices defended the project as a necessary investment in the country's legislative institution. Others viewed the rising figures as a reminder of long-standing concerns about government spending. The debate itself became part of the story. In many ways, the moment echoed earlier controversies. In the country's political history, public attention returning once again to the question of how national funds are used, how projects are managed, and how institutions respond when scrutiny intensifies. For a time, the new Senate building dominated headlines. Budget figures were discussed. Project reviews were announced. Public attention focused on the structure rising in Taguig. But as with many national issues, the question remained: would the attention continue? Or would something else soon capture the country's focus? For a period of time, the Senate building project remained part of the national conversation. Budget figures were discussed. Construction timelines were reviewed. Officials provided updates on the status of the project. But public attention rarely remains fixed on one issue indefinitely. As new events emerged across the country, the focus of national discussion began to shift. The review process continued. Construction planning continued. Administrative discussions continued. But these developments increasingly occurred outside the center of national attention. The project had not disappeared. It had simply moved back into the background of institutional processes. This pattern had appeared before. One national issue rises. It dominates. Headlines. Investigations begin. Debates unfold. And then, gradually, the spotlight moves somewhere else. The underlying processes continue, but the audience has already turned to the next story. The Senate Building project remained under construction. Budget discussions did not vanish. Administrative oversight did not end. Yet the intensity of public attention began to soften. Not because every question had been answered, but because the national conversation had moved forward. And as that shift unfolded, the country prepared to face another emerging issue, one that would soon grow larger, one that would pull the national spotlight away once again. The pattern was about to repeat. Looking back, the story of the new Senate building was not only about construction, it was also about attention. Over the past decade, the country had witnessed a series of national issues that briefly commanded public focus. Investigations were launched, budgets were questioned, institutions responded, and then, gradually, the spotlight shifted again. Each moment felt urgent while it unfolded. Each issue seemed to demand answers. Yet the rhythm of national conversation often moves faster than the processes designed to resolve those questions. Projects continue, reviews continue, administrative procedures continue. But public attention rarely stays in one place for long. The Senate building remained under construction. Reviews and discussions about its cost continued within government channels. But outside those institutions, the national conversation had already begun to move elsewhere. Another story was emerging. Another issue preparing to take its place at the center of public attention. This pattern does not necessarily mean that issues disappear. Many continue quietly within courts, committees, and government offices. But the pace of public discourse moves differently. The spotlight moves forward, even when the underlying questions remain. And once again, the country turned its attention to the next headline, leaving another national issue to continue its story after the headlines.